Hey guys, welcome once again to the Layman's Lounge, and we're once again tackling another evidence for the existence of God. And just to summarize what we've tackled so far, number one for the existence of God, we looked at the cosmological argument, which basically says if there was a Big Bang, it requires a Big Banger. Number two, the teleological argument, which says that if there is a designed world, it requires a designer. It also talked about the fine-tuning of the universe, which says that there are so many, or the odds are against the idea of any life existing and the universe existing, and yet it did, and somehow the deck seems to be stacked, and that seems to point to a designer who did that rather than just random chance. And today I want to look at the evidence number 3, which is the moral argument. Now, there have been lots of different forms of the moral argument made by different people over the years. Immanuel Kant is one who was one of the first ones to do that in more modern times, but we've had several others do it. The simplest form of this argument is in 3 steps. And number 1, it says, if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Number 2, but we know that objective moral values do exist. And number 3, therefore God does exist. Now, kind of expanding on that, one form of the argument that I really like is C.S. Lewis, who was the author of the Chronicles of Narnia series, but he also had a lot of good nonfiction books as well. And this is his version of the moral argument, which is a little more expansive. He says, number 1, there must be a universal moral law, or else, and he gives 4 things. Number 1, moral disagreements would make no sense, as we all assume that they do. Number 2, all moral criticisms would be meaningless, for example, saying that the Nazis were wrong. Number 3, it is unnecessary to keep promises or treaties, as we all assume that it is. And number 4, we would not make excuses for breaking the moral law, as we all do. Okay, that's all 5 parts in his first main point. Number 2, he says, but a universal moral law requires a universal moral lawgiver, since the source of it, number 1, gives moral commands, as lawgivers do, and number 2, is interested in our behavior, as moral persons are. Number 3, further, this universal moral lawgiver must be absolutely good. Otherwise, all moral effort would be futile in the long run, since we could be sacrificing our lives for what is not ultimately right. And also, the source of all good must be absolutely good, since the standard of all good must be completely good. And lastly, he says there must be an absolutely good moral lawgiver. Now, there are a couple objections to this. And one objection is somebody who might identify themselves as an atheist, and they say, I recognize that there are moral values, and I try to live a moral life, but I don't necessarily believe that there's a God out there who exists. And, of course, atheists can recognize moral values or try to live moral lives, but recognizing something and even living by it doesn't mean that one has a real basis for doing that. So the moral atheist is really left hanging in the middle of the air on this because there's no reason for them to have moral values without God. It's really everything goes if there's no God. Everything is all relative. It's just my opinion versus yours, or my society's opinion versus somebody else's. C.S. Lewis, in one of his points that I mentioned, even saying that the Nazis were wrong. Well, you might think that the Nazis are wrong, but it would be wrong for you to do anything about it because the Nazis thought what they were doing was right. And hence there's no real moral values in that. So really you do have to have an ultimate standard and there to be a God out there, otherwise everything goes. So some people say that, well, moral law is really just kind of instinct. It's not anything that is something that goes for all people that relates to a moral lawgiver. But really, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out too, he says, what we call the moral law can't be the result of instinct, or else the stronger impulse would always win. But it doesn't. We always act from instinct rather than selflessly to help someone, as we sometimes do. If the moral law were just instinct, then instincts would always be right. But sometimes instincts are not always right. Even love and patriotism are sometimes wrong in certain contexts. So it's not simply instinct. Sometimes just doing something out of a pure reaction might be a bad thing. Number two, some people might say that this is just a social convention. There's no moral law, it's just the conventions. But the moral law can't be mere social convention, because not everything learned through society is based on social convention. So society has learned math and logic, but that's not through social convention, for example. The same basic moral laws can be found in virtually every society, past and present. So judgments about social progress really wouldn't be possible if society were the basis for judgments. But we always talk about how societies improve, but how can you really say that there is a measure of improvement if there's really no moral standard out there? Also, people may object and say that this is just a law of nature, it's not a moral law. But moral law is not to be identified with the laws of nature, because a natural law is always something that's descriptive of how it is, not prescriptive, the way things ought to be. So natural law talks about describes how things are, but it doesn't say how things ought to be. So those are some big objections. One last one, people point to there being a injustice in the world and evil, and they say, how can a God exist when things aren't right with the world? Surely if there was a God and there was real morality out there, then we wouldn't have all these problems. Well, really, this is actually a perfect argument for a moral lawgiver, because if the world isn't perfect, that almost presupposes that there is a perfect standard out there. But as I had mentioned, if there's no God, everything goes. There isn't one way things ought to be. It's just the way it is. That's just part of life, each and everything. So you really can't object to it. So what I'm saying is that the existence of evil and saying that there's something not right in this world and things have failed presupposes that there is a real way that things should be, and hence a moral lawgiver. It also goes on to say that because this world is not the way it should be, that there is something better out there. And that then gets into specific religions that try to answer what is the answer to the problem of evil and what is God doing about that. And that's where you get into specific religions. But to sum up, the moral argument, again, says that if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. We know that objective moral values do exist, therefore God does exist. So that is the third line of evidence to the existence of God. We will be making another video about kind of a collection of different evidences that I'm not just going to do one video for. But these are the main three that I think are very powerful when put all together. But I did want to mention about some of the others. Some of them are better than others, but I did want to briefly outline those. So stay tuned for next time for that. In the meantime, comment below on your thoughts about the moral argument, and also please subscribe.